Littlerock, California by E.W. Martin. In 1860, prospectors were prospecting out by Lovejoy Springs Butte. John Hancock built a large tunnel in Big Rock about this time. George Gleason and a boy had a fight with the Indians in 1860, and Tex, the boy, he was shot. They took him on horse to mining camp, and he lived until about 30 years afterwards. Old-timers from El Medina would ask about this country as they rode through. Part of this country where the Nashes lived, and that would be Palmdale Boulevard and 96th Street. Used to be known as Wild Horse Prairie. There are wild horses there when they came out here. John Mathis shot the last wild horse about 7 miles north of Littlerock. Rodney Kane caught a wild stallion and broke it to ride. They would ride in circles around the horses, and others would come out and get them. They would keep them away from the springs and keep them running until they give out. The first settler on Big Rock Creek was L.C. Tillman's. The first settler on the west side was Matthew Palin's. He had a place near Chase's Vineyard at Pear Blossom. He had an orchard and a vineyard that was 7 years old, but he died about then. That would have been about 1890. His orchard and vineyard are all dried up now. Here at Little Rock Creek, the first settler was Juan Garcia, who lived by the hills at the old adobe and was buried up at San Gabriel Canyon at the present dam. The old adobe house was on the old stage line. There was another one at Beryl Springs. At Big Rock Creek, there was an old adobe on Valyermo Road. They dug a ditch in 1887. Shoemaker's place had Indians on it. They farmed part of the ranch. A white man by the name of Salisbury had an all-squaw wife, and they called him Squaw Man all the time. Shoemaker brought out those Indians in 1887. The last Indians left in 1891. They was east of Mescal Creek. There was an English syndicate started to build a dam on Big Rock Creek in 1889 and 1890, but the irrigation district was formed then and served an injunction and stopped the proceedings. Chinese did the only labor on this dam. There was a colony of Quakers out where Yano is now. I went there in the spring of 1890. Curtis, Cyrus, Baldwin, Paddock, and Fazer were some of the people in the colony. There were a few others, too. The first real settlers were Bent and Rowan. Bent was the father of Bent's brother in Los Angeles. Bent sold out to the Cole brothers of St. Louis. There was Nathan Cole, Jr., Richard, and Dr. Cole. Dr. Cole and Dick Cole sold their interest to Billings in Los Angeles, who took it over. They formed the Little Rock Creek Irrigation District in 1892. They built the barn that is in my yard in 1888, and it caved in by a big snowstorm in 1932. It was known as the Cole Ranch. This house that I'm living in was built in 1894 by Billings. The first real colony in this place was principally in 1893. That was when we moved here from Big Rock Creek, and we are the only family that stayed straight through. We were only a year at Yano and 1 year on the Shoemaker Ranch where Pallet is now. The next colony was the Sweet and Wilson colony. It was started in 1893. It was composed of Iowa, Illinois, and Kansas families chiefly. They had come to know this place because it was advertised in Farm and Fieldside magazine. The only cement house was Longview near Phillips Place, was built 30 years ago by Carter in 1900. There were lots of cattle ranches in this country. We had lots more rain and water during those years. Little Rock was named after the creek by the early settlers that drove through. They would also ask about the Big Meadows, meaning Big Rock Creek. The first post office in Little Rock was in 1893. There has been one continuously since that time. The first post office in Yano was 1890, and it's been there continuously. Before that, the settlers would carry the mail themselves 2 or 3 times a week. The next post office was built in Myrtle on Carter Ranch. Afterward, it was known as Almondale. They had quite a little town there, 3 stores and a blacksmith shop. The present site is known as Hammond Ranch. There was a settlement of about 200 people there in 1894. The adobe in Littlerock was built by Juan Garcia, who was killed by a bear in the 70s in Santiago Canyon by the dam. He wounded the bear and looked for him the next day. Garcia crawled in the bush, and there was the bear, and the bear killed him. The last bear that I know of that was killed was by George Miller in San Bernardino in 1900, I believe. The post office when we came here was in Herald, known as Alpine Springs. The old settlement of Palmdale was started near John Boyle's place. The present post office at Valyarmo was known as Shoemaker, and it was started by Bighorn Mine Working. The schoolhouse was built in 1895. They only had about 6 weeks of school, and that was in the summer. The meaning of llano is plains. It's a Spanish word. The colony started up in 1914 and commenced to break up in 1918. The earlier Quaker colony only lasted about 3 years. They came from Orange. Then there were a few different ones that came in and joined in on llano. First one and then another came and went. The Kidd family came there in the fall of 1891. There was Herbert, Amory, and a sister. The school was open in the fall of 1891. There were about 10 scholars. The second period was when the Sweet and Wilson colony came in about 1896. Then they had 3 years of continuous drought that moved the people out. At the same time, there was a colony that started up at Mescal Creek known as the Graham Colony. The Socialist colony was the third and the largest of all. At one time, there was about 2,000 people living there. I've seen 45 students in the Almondale School when it was at its highest. They got their water from Big Rock Creek, and there's always been arguments over the water. The people raised some stock and some hay, and they would live up to their income until they would have no more, and they'd just get up and leave. Here in Little Rock, we had orchards, and we kept working continuously. We had smaller orchards and a steady run of water. Little Rock was first started with almond trees, and then pears were put in place because the almonds were not successful. We sold the first ton of pears to Ludwig and Mathis. They were the first shipped out of Antelope Valley in 1901. We had heard of Little Rock through the Quaker colony at Alameda. When we came here first, we stayed on Shoemaker Ranch. But he was in difficulty and with the water proposition, so we left, and there was an opening here for contracts to clear out orchards and clear land with coal. There were 6 or 8 people when we moved here in 1893. The oldest pear trees were planted in the last of February of March of 1893, and they're still bearing fruit. There was a stage that came through before the railroad was constructed, and different adobes were stage stations. That was before I came here. Little Rock got its supply of water from the Little Rock Creek and the Garcia Cienega. The water supply diminished in the latter part of 1890. The heaviest flood I ever knew was February 2nd of 1891. Tillman lost 1 horse and a wagon load with goods. He got on the horse and rode it all the way to the shore because the water was so deep. In 1910, the Mathis family went to bed and awoke to find water all over the house. They were forced to leave their place in January of 1910. The canyon was not there until that time. They had 3 boats on the Pallet Ranch. They used to run many head of cattle through the valley. The 3 Pallet brothers gathered 1,400 head of cattle one day. The earlier settlers used to gather for 4th of July picnics. They would start on the 3rd and go home on the 5th or 6th. They would have dances and camp out during the night. There were quite a number of bears in the mountains and several mountain lions, too. Only rarely did the bears get down into the valley. Once in a while they would cross the valley and go to the far Nevadas, but seldom did they come nearer than the Pevley Springs. When the Indians cooked, they would heat their stones in a fire and throw the stones in a basket and cook that way. Lou Tillman had the first machine in the south side of the valley in 1910. It was a 2-cylinder Auburn. The first school organized here was in 1893, and it ran for only 2 or 3 years and then was discontinued. It didn't start up again until 10 or 15 years later. There never were more than 15 in the school in the first place, and not more than 8 or 10 of them at a time. The first store was here in 1894, and a fellow had it for a year or so and then left. It included dry goods and everything combined. They didn't have enough stock or money to run anything. The second store ran for 2 years until the drought. Then there wasn't a store until Lewis came in 1911. The people got good money for their crops for a while. The almond prices were low, pears were transplanted, and the pear market went down, and olives never paid. Most of the people had a hard struggle to get along. The whole family would work in the harvest. Where Jackson Lake is near the county park, they were raising potatoes when I came here. They raised lots of potatoes on the old Pallet Ranch, too. Shoemaker raised alfalfa, kept cows, and sold butter. Pugh homesteaded Noah Berry's trout club and raised apples. He was there when we came here. Well, that should do it for now. Y'all might want to go over and talk to Myrtle E. Bursling. She'd probably have some stories for you. Anyway, thanks for coming by. It was a pleasure meeting y'all.